With my time today, I'm going to share some facets of my book, which is titled Dongfang He, The East is Black, Cold War China in the Black Radical Imagination. The book examines these relations between China and African Americans during the context of the Cold War. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll close with a couple of, well, at least one quick example of contemporary exchanges between African Americans in China. So as I said, my book explores these relations between the years of 1949 and 1976. During the Cold War, a central feature of Chinese foreign policy was extending support to national liberation and decolonial movements through rhetoric and some material aid. In so doing, the Chinese government framed itself as on the front lines of anti-imperialism, as committed to confronting global white supremacy and US/Soviet hegemony head-on. African-American civil rights activists, particularly those of a more militant and leftist or radical ideological bend, were also included in this outreach. And throughout the Cold War, several of them were invited to visit China to at least experience firsthand views of China's road to socialism. A few even relocated to China and were allowed political refuge from McCarthyism and anti-communism's impact on US life. Moreover, through media and travel, both these black radicals and the Chinese government and people situated the American black freedom struggle against racial discrimination, class exploitation, and poverty as part of a worldwide movement of which China was a leading agent. One of the first cultural productions that articulated such messages was artist-activist Paul Robeson's rendition of Iyongjun Jinxingchu, or what we know in the US as March of the Volunteers. In his concert performances, Robeson periodically directed the song's anti-slavery message, so Chilai, Buyuan, Zo Nuli de Renmin, arise, all those who refuse to be slaves. He would direct this message towards African-American listeners, right, encouraging them to associate its anti-imperialist, anti-slavery message with their own movement against Jim Crow racism. The song was also released by Keynote Records on an album with Robeson singing this song and other Chinese resistance songs in the early 1940s. In any case, within the travails of the Korean War, Robeson's rendition of the song was resurrected on the public address systems of Chinese-run prisoner camps that housed incarcerated American POWs. Aimed primarily at black male prisoners, Chinese authorities used the songs for two reasons. First, to create racial dissension and division among black and white troops, but as well as an instrument of public diplomacy. That is, as a strategy to call attention to US racial injustice and to denounce American imperialism. For a small handful of the black POWs, the playing of March of the Volunteers in the prison camp illuminated several intriguing paradoxes. First, it conveyed that as the American government attacked, censured, and prevented Robeson from travel and earning income due to his political views, the Chinese were citing his music and activism. Secondly, it offered a reminder that as American exceptionalism stressed the importance of spreading democracy and capitalism globally, poor white Americans, African Americans, and other racial minorities lacked the basic necessities of life and were being sent to Korea to kill other people of color. Several of these troops went on to form pacifist reading groups in the camp, author petitions condemning the war, and broadcast their views on Radio Peking, calling for the United Nations to end the war. A few even declined repatriation back to the US and opted to relocate to China. 3 of these non-repatriates were black, a group which included Clarence Adams, who you see on the screen, a private from Memphis. Ironically, a former POW, when interviewed by an American journalist, reported that before leaving for China, Adams encouraged several black prisoners to not sit idly once they returned to the US, that they should return to the US and, quote, fight for the rights of colored people and join Paul Robeson in the fight for peace, end quote. Another kind of interesting just fact about, in relation to Adams, actually ties into what Clay was referencing earlier about how, how reporters and Americans in general were banned from traveling to China throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And he showed that clip of Robert Cohen speaking about, traveling with this delegation of American students in 1957 to China. Actually, the first American to break the ban on American journalist travel to China was an African American named William Worthy, who was a reporter for the Baltimore Afro-American and a foreign correspondent for CBS. And Worthy actually travels to China in December 1956 and is there throughout January and February of 1957, and he interviews Adams and William C. White and Lawrence Sullivan, these 3 African-American non-repatriates who are, studying in Beijing. Now, in the years following the following the Korean War, the Chinese government echoed its claims of solidarity with African Americans. The most well-known example being Chairman Mao Zedong's statement in support of the civil rights movement in early August 1963. Issued just weeks before the impending March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the statement was issued alongside a propaganda poster that portrayed China's international solidarity with African American liberation. As you see, here's the poster. Its caption reads, resolutely support the just struggle of African Americans. The image positioned black Americans as an enslaved population, working in what Mao described in the statement as, quote, the most backbreaking and most despised jobs, end quote, and whose resistance was, quote, unarmed, barehanded, end quote. The image thus likened black American political struggle to slave resistance of previous centuries, a framing that tied into Mao and the Chinese Communist Party's line of Third World Revolution, where the countryside was privileged as the seedbed of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist global struggle. The above iconography therefore offered Chinese publics an accessible encoding of African Americans' plight. Black Americans were depicted as elements of the global rural poor, the US equivalent to the revolutionary class that, at least according to the Chinese Communist Party, would ultimately defeat global capitalism. The figures in this image thus denoted a certain metaphorical transfer of embodiment between black Americans, China, and world struggle. If we look at the image, we see the Capitol in the distance, made to represent the West, the poster's heavenly red hue signifying communism and the East rising wind, and black American rebels denoting the crushing force of a global world proletariat movement led by China. Through such propaganda and, moreover, state-hosted visits, the Chinese government reached out to various African American political activists. For instance, scholar-activist W.B. Du Bois and his wife, playwright and activist in her own right, Shirley Graham Du Bois, visited China in February 1959. Over the course of 2 months, they traveled several thousand miles throughout the country, visiting communes, universities, factories, and receiving honors and treatment not bestowed on them in their own homeland. While Du Bois described the visit as, quote, the most fascinating 8 weeks of travel and sightseeing, end quote, that he had ever experienced, Shirley Graham Du Bois left China believing that the rapid economic development and mass mobilization of its public might represent the future of the developing world. China, she argued to many of her colleagues back in the States, therefore represented, quote, the land of tomorrow. Black radical couple Robert and Mabel Williams also traveled to China and described it in similar terms. Offered political refuge in Beijing after Robert was falsely accused of kidnapping by the North Carolina State Police. The couple and their 2 teenage sons made Beijing their home throughout the mid to late 1960s. There, with support from the government, they produced various forms of radical media that connected political developments in China and elsewhere with the necessity of cultivating broad-based internationalism among working class and working poor African Americans. In Mao-like fashion, the couple asserted that every revolution required radical media, what the couple referred to as, quote, their cultural army, end quote. Actually, and here's a statement they made, which is very, also, kind of very Maoist. Quote, the pen and the gun are indispensable instruments that complement each other, end quote, they argued. A great example of this is a film they produced in 1964, which was based off of their travels throughout mainland China. The film, Robert Williams in China, was shot by 3 Chinese cameramen, and it attempted to display China's road to development and modernization as a model for other Asian and African populations. Another member of this expatriate community to which the Williams were members was Black feminist activist and educator Vicki Garvin. She relocated to Shanghai in 1964 and taught at the Institute of Foreign Languages. There she served as an English language instructor, the majority of her students training to become English language instructors, translators, and government aides. She also instructed these groups in African American history, at least what I believe to be the first course of its kind in a Chinese university. To encourage initiative and creativity, she assigned a project on African American history where each student was to produce a research paper and presentation on a particular facet of African American history, and the students' papers covered a range of topics and themes ranging from 19th century Negro struggles for freedom, women in the Black liberation movement, and youth and Negro struggle. These papers, moreover, culminated with student-led presentations at a conference of English language educators and language students in May 1965. Now, these are just but a few of the examples that I examined in my book, but moreover, I pay close attention to the contradictions and inconsistencies, negotiations, and ambivalence that mired these people's celebration of China. These activists' endorsements of China and China's championing of African-American civil rights relied on romanticized depictions of anti-imperialism, images and discourses that reinscribed problematic essentialist depictions of both Asians and African-Americans. Black radicals consequently helped China's influence grow during the Cold War, their support simultaneously aiding the government in concealing many of its repressive domestic practices and policies. Furthermore, while these activists were treated as dignitaries during their stays in China, African students studying at Chinese universities suffered severe racial discrimination and repression, much of which was the result of African men's fraternization with Chinese women, such interracial relationships and friendships viewed as taboo by many Chinese citizens. It is also important to note that despite these examples of Chinese relations with African Americans, the majority of African American households held negative perceptions of China throughout the Cold War. For example, a 1969 poll that examined African American viewpoints on China revealed that the majority of blacks polled believed that Americans, quote, could not in the long run live peacefully with communist China, end quote. Now, while Sino-American rapprochement meant the decline of these radical relations between China and Black America, it did not mean the end of African American interest in China. However, thereafter, the majority of this interest, like that of other Western communities, was driven more by economic motivations rather than generating political and third world solidarity. In 1980, for instance, African-American business magazine Black Enterprise was reporting that the Chinese government was, quote, actively courting Black businessmen to become part of more than $1.2 billion export businesses that US firms were then doing with China yearly, end quote. However, what has grasped my attention as of late have been other examples of Chinese African-American cultural exchange, particularly the rise of hip-hop culture in China, collaborations between Chinese and African-American artists, and the increasing popularity of basketball and Black American athletes in China. Rather than detail all of these phenomena, I will close by just referencing the artwork of Los Angeles native and now China resident, Kehinde Wiley. Born and reared actually in South Central Los Angeles, so in the community which surrounds USC, the Nigerian-American Wiley has risen to art fame as a result of his immense portraitures that display Black men in what some perceive to be unexpected historical and geographic contexts and settings. Wiley's works usually juxtapose Western history and classical art with contemporary urban black men. So what you see here is a kind of a classical painting of Napoleon, right, which Wiley has appropriated and really appropriated, and then the subject has become, you know, a black man that you might see just walking on USC's campus, right? In producing these works, he approaches black men on blocks such as 125th Street in Harlem or Crenshaw Boulevard here in Los Angeles, and then engages in a conversation with them about portraiture and about power and about the politics of portraiture, right? He's really interested, first off, so he gives them books of portraiture to assess, and he's interested in having a conversation with them about which ones stand out to them, right? What do they suggest about masculinity? What do they suggest about posing, about history, right? And then he asks them to select one which they would like to model themselves after, right? And so the work is produced out of these kinds of conversations between he and these regular people about art and its relationship to history, right? In any case, and actually here's an interesting piece. He actually did a Michael Jackson right before Michael Jackson passed away. However, over the last few years, Wiley has embarked on what he calls the World Stage Project, where he sets up studios around the world and fuses local cultural imagery with his black American male subjects. Several years ago, Wiley traveled to Beijing and painted images of black men that appropriated Maoist propaganda from the Cultural Revolution. This art, first off, questions the invisibility of non-white people within kind of classical portraiture, right? But as well, it also questions China's past and ideas about a once powerful Maoist government. Wiley, when interviewed, said that one of the things which led him to be intrigued with using, or at least appropriating this imagery, was it's kind of the ubiquitous kind of use of this former kind of propaganda posters within like Chinese tea shops in Beijing and on various kinds of like cultural artifacts. He was interested in how this history either was being utilized in a different kind of way in this contemporary moment. By using it, he was interested in at least challenging current Chinese and American understandings of context, commerce, nationality, race, and masculinity. But moreover, his travel to China produced his travel to China to produce these works led him to become also fascinated with the immense transformations which the country is experiencing. And as a result, over the past 5 years, he's called China, and specifically Beijing, home. He set up studio right off of Third Ring Road, where he works with Chinese assistants to produce his work. In sum, his works are part of an ongoing conversation between African Americans and Chinese society, and his art attempts to engage some of the dilemmas of cross-cultural engagement and exchange. That is the blind spots, contradictions, miscommunications, and power inequalities that encompass all intercultural relations. Wiley's images push, extend, and problematize this dialogue between Black Americans and Chinese people and convey a sentiment which I share with him regarding the necessity of cross-cultural contact, but as well the difficulty in producing productive kinds of exchanges about difference, especially among diverse populations. Thank you so much.